Welcome to the Classroom Narratives Healing and Education podcast, the space where education meets resilience. I'm Joey Weisler, and in each episode, we dive deep into the personal stories of educators, students, leaders, and frontline advocates who are navigating the complexities of modern education. Whether you're just starting your teaching journey or are a seasoned professional looking for inspiration, we'll explore how to foster meaningful change, prevent burnout, and build trauma-informed communities in our schools. Now, let's take a seat at the front of the classroom and get started. All right, well, hello everyone. Welcome to the inaugural solo episode of Classroom Narratives Healing and Education podcast. I'm Joey Weisler, your host, and I am thrilled to have you here. Whether you are an educator, a student, or someone passionate about the topic of education, this podcast is going to be for you. In this podcast, we're going to be exploring stories of resilience, trauma-informed education, and the human side of teaching and learning. This is going to be a space where educators, students, and mental health professionals will all come together to share stories of survival, transformation, and even hope as we explore trauma-informed education and ways to help foster resilience within classrooms everywhere. So a little bit about me as your host to begin with. I am a scholar, I am a teacher, and I am someone who has spent years in education, both as a classroom educator and a postgraduate researcher. I've had firsthand experiences with the pressures and emotional tolls of education, especially in post-trauma, which have inspired me from the very beginning to start this podcast. I'd like to go ahead and share 3 very personal examples that have deeply shaped my journey in this podcast. The first example that I would like to illustrate is that I am a native to the city of Parkland, Florida, with my alma mater being Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School. On February 14th, 2018, Marjory Stoneman Douglas, or MSD as we call it, experienced a mass shooting that killed 17 people and wounded 17 others. I spent that tragic Valentine's Day right next door to MSD in the adjoining feeder middle school, where several victims of that shooting had attended years prior, and it was my true honor to get to know some of these individuals as their day-to-day substitute teacher as early as spring 2016. Together, my community faced both ongoing and uncharted trauma as we all attempted to navigate through what was an anguishing sense of a new normal in the aftermath of that event. I was actually one of the first subs to go back to MSD in March 2018 after receiving the grief counseling in order to do so. And I chose to go back very quickly in order to what I coin as transforming my post-traumatic stress into post-traumatic strength. And I felt that being visible for the students really helps me do that because at the time, presence was something that all of us needed to have in order to move forward. The second point that's important for me to share with you is that as an adolescent at Stoneman Douglas, I deliberately chose to be a separatist and outcast myself from my peers. In my senior year, I was actually very fortunate to befriend a classmate who really helped me see beyond that. This person allowed me to acknowledge my choice to be a separatist and told me that I had the willpower to carry out the 2 goals that I had really cared to achieve, even at that time as a high school student, which was to become an educator and a writer. I had worked tirelessly to show post-traumatic strength throughout the schools in the Parkland community until my friend's passing by suicide just a few short months after the tragedy. This friend was a person who has and continues to hold great meaning to my life, and when you lose someone who has touched you so deeply, you begin to cycle through, as we say in literature, the 5 W's and a how, in thinking about those who, what, where, when, why, and how questions. Specifically, thinking about where were the signs that I missed? What could I have possibly done to extend this person's life? And of course, just a singular question, why? I found my W statements, or the where, what, and why, to be very guilting on me and harming my ability to find any sort of resilience in the aftermath of my friend's passing. Instead, I could only carry forth once I began looking at the how. That is, how can I operate and educate in a manner that will allow this person's memory to remain blessed and sacred for others? Being that this person had always believed in me so much in life, and remarkably advocated for my dream to become a teacher and a writer. How can I use this gut-wrenching loss, I thought, to ensure my future students feel happy, healthy, and safe? And what are the signs for me to now look for in doing so? Immediately after my friend's passing, I received training in ASSIST, which translates to Applied Suicide Prevention Skills. And ASSIST is a training that enables someone to notice when someone else is in a crisis and become a PAL or a PAL for that person in order to provide a pathway for assisting life, PAL. And being trained in ASSIST is like being trained in CPR, but for suicidal ideation, where we keep a subject sustained until he or she can be professionally revived of life, very literally. And as someone trained in ASSIST, we are taught to be there and keep our subjects safe for now until the next trained medical professional can properly help them. So after my friend's passing, I trained in ASSIST and held a vow to reach as many students as I possibly could, or as I said at the time, never allow myself to have blood on my hands from a student. I made this promise while still subbing throughout MSD, and now also transitioning that fall semester after the tragedy to an interim position at the Feeder Middle School, feeling as if every single day I went to work that I was standing on the ashes and dust of my city, trying to go back to the roots and live out what I expected to be my dream job. In her 1999 article, Narratives of Pain, Professor Lisa Tyler says that healing is not the primary responsibility of a classroom teacher, but if an institution of learning has real live students on its hands, then its hands are already dirty. And the purpose of this podcast is to acknowledge the controversies and the dangers of allowing emotions to play a part in the classroom. And my goal during these episodes is to offer solutions through the use of helping you form a mindset in order to suggest safer measures that can be both reliable and effective to working alongside students. The third thing that's important for me to tell you is how those two events together reshaped and even sustained the concept of what I thought my classroom should look like when I began teaching, but before I even officially started my first year of teaching and having my own classroom. Inspired by my late grandmother, as a New York City school principal, as well as an upbringing of phenomenal Parkland instructors as early as kindergarten, my childhood inspiration was rooted in no other place than the classroom. Now, before moving forward, I do want to give a very sincere shout out to each of my former Parkland teachers, for it was their presence and the way that they've led their classrooms that has left a very enduring impression on me, even long after I've graduated. And though I don't express it as much as I should, I am so incredibly thankful to each of them, and I reflect on their influence during challenging times. And this is also very applicable to each of my undergraduate instructors at Florida Atlantic University as well, and of course, even in postgraduate studies at St. John's University in Queens, New York. A big thank you to each of you who have helped this vision come to life and have sustained it for so long. So this podcast is going to advocate for a trauma-informed curriculum that works to teach the heart over the brain. So as an English professor, I always tell students that on my first day of class that they are not taking what we would call an English class or even a language arts class, but rather my courses tend to blend in combination with what those look like. And by that, I mean that I choose to be an instructor for the art of language. And for me, that's attempting to study the power of language in a way that helps us heal ourselves, heal others, and make ourselves stronger individuals. And in my classes, we work each day towards our class theme of Our Moments Matter. So what I was not prepared for was the additional PTSD that I would acquire in my opening years alone as a quote-unquote caregiver for my students, including those immediately after the Parkland tragedy, and even others who were visibly showing signs of the same signs that I felt I'd missed in my late friend. Before the end of my first year teaching, I came to find that I had neglected my own wellness as a result of investing so much into the well-being of my students. And as a result of both additional and unchecked PTSD, I ended up burning out after my first year of teaching. And this was a realization that had entirely shattered the fantasy that I had held onto since I was a child. So my research focus as a doctoral candidate emphasizes that we need more stories of mental health that can reach mass audiences, and like our teachers that work to teach to the hearts of our students, these stories should reach the hearts of our audiences. And maybe you found this podcast because you too have felt disillusioned by the education system, or you're struggling with the emotional toll of teaching. And that's why you're here. And this is a space where we can acknowledge those struggles and really try to work through them. Your presence here on this podcast as a listener is going to be the first step in showing the necessity of having conversations that break the stigma around mental health, trauma, and burnout in education, while creating spaces for healing, growth, and meaningful change in our classrooms and communities. In one of my favorite novels, The Help by Catherine Stockett, narrator Aileen says, telling our stories is what makes us free. So in each episode, I'll be having deep conversations with teachers, trauma experts, and even students who have navigated the hardships of the classroom. You'll be hearing stories of survival, courage, and practical strategies to help you avoid burnout. Whether you're a new teacher trying to find your footing, a veteran teacher who's burned out by the system, or someone just curious, and the intersection of trauma and education, even if you're a student or a leader or a mental health counselor, this is going to be the podcast that will give you the tools and the stories and the hope for exactly what you've been looking for. I plan for these episodes to be about half an hour, and I'll be mixing it up between solo episodes where I dive into personal stories and also having interviews with guests from all areas of education and mental health as well. So I also wanted to mention real quick how if you were to go into literature, literature also tends to take a great big focus on the broken dream. And we see this quite evidently through John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, Edgar Allan Poe's short El Dorado, and Dr. Seuss's book, I've Had Trouble in Finding My Way to Salisalu. And when you look at this holistically, it becomes very little wonder as to how society is coming to terms with destigmatizing exhaustion. It's become my belief that we live in a society where we value exhaustion, but don't quite know how to care for the exhausted. And this leads to a series of consequences, including the broken dream. So, with urgent attention to exploring this phenomenon in education, this podcast is also going to discuss the emotional and mental toll of burnout on both educators and students. By highlighting stories of resilience, trauma-informed approaches, and practical solutions for reform, the Classroom Narratives Healing in Education podcast is going to aim here to foster conversations that help reshape the future of education, making it a space where teachers and students can thrive without losing themselves in the process. When I was in my undergraduate years of college, still honeymooning with what I anticipated to be this approaching perfect start to my forever after career, I would have never expected that my city would experience mass violence while also losing my very close friends to suicide so close together, with two events completely out of my control, yet significantly shifting my image as an educator. Since you're here, I'd love for you to subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with anyone you think that might benefit from it. I'm also always open to hearing from my listeners, so please don't ever hesitate to reach out with your thoughts or your questions or comments in general. This podcast strives to provide its listeners with what I consider to be a break glass if needed toolkit when dealing with trauma in the classroom. I've learned from my own story, and this podcast pays homage to making your story better. Hey, thank you so much for listening, and stay tuned as we transform our scars into stars here in education. Take care. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us on the Classroom Narratives Healing in Education podcast. If today's episode inspired you or made you think differently, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment or review wherever you listen to podcasts, and stay connected with us on the @Classroom Narratives podcast over Instagram and Facebook. Remember, together we can transform our scars into stars in education, one conversation at a time.